Right now, at this exact moment, the most advanced military on Earth is quietly dependent on something most Americans never think about. Not oil, not software, not rare earth magnets, a metal you probably last touched as a coin or a piece of jewelry. Because as of today, every Tomahawk missile sitting in a U.S. arsenal has a hidden deadline baked into it. Picture a Tomahawk cruise missile, 18 feet long, flying at roughly 550 miles per hour, capable of striking a target more than 1,000 miles away with near surgical precision. It is one of the most reliable weapons the United States has ever built. When people imagine it, they see steel, explosives, jet fuel, power. What they do not see is the part that decides whether that missile is a weapon or a very expensive piece of scrap metal. Buried inside the guidance system, the wiring, and the specialized batteries is roughly 15 kilograms of pure silver, about 500 ounces. At today's prices, that silver is worth maybe $30,000 to $40,000. On a missile that costs around $2 million, it looks insignificant, a rounding error, loose change. But here's the part almost no one tells you. Without that silver, the missile does not fly. The guidance system goes blind. The battery cannot deliver the initial surge to start the engine. The electronics fail. The weapon never leaves the rail. Silver is not decoration. It is not optional. It is the physical nerve system of modern warfare. For decades, the United States built its military on the assumption that materials would always be there when needed. Ships, planes, missiles, all scalable, all replaceable. That assumption is now colliding with reality. Because when it comes to silver, the smallest component is quietly becoming the most decisive one. And once you understand that, the rest of the story becomes unavoidable. If silver sounds like an odd dependency for a superpower, that's because most people picture war as steel and fire. But modern war is electricity, signals, heat, timing measured in microseconds, and in that world, silver isn't a luxury. It's physics. Silver is the best conductor of electricity on Earth. It is also the best conductor of heat. No alloy beats it, no substitute matches it. Electrons move through silver faster and with less resistance than through copper or aluminum. In a kitchen appliance, that difference barely matters. If a toaster runs a little hot or a signal degrades, nothing catastrophic happens. But war does not allow margins, and the battlefield does not forgive hesitation. That distinction is where everything changes. In a fighter jet moving at Mach 2, a satellite orbiting in vacuum, or a missile traveling hundreds of miles autonomously, failure is not an inconvenience. It is mission death. You need current to flow instantly. You need heat to dissipate without sparks. You need contacts that do not corrode, degrade, or hesitate. That metal is silver. And there is no close second, which is why the military keeps reaching for it, again and again. Look inside a modern weapon system. Silver zinc batteries, power torpedoes, and drones because they deliver enormous energy in a small, reliable package. They are safer than lithium ion, but they require large amounts of silver plates. Jet engine bearings are often electroplated with silver because silver is the best solid lubricant known. If oil pressure fails mid-flight, that silver coating can be the difference between landing and catastrophe. And that difference decides outcomes. Now zoom out. Every military satellite relies on silver. Solar panels use it. Connectors use it. RF systems depend on silver-coated contacts to transmit clean signals across extreme distances. The entire communications backbone of modern warfare runs through silver at dozens of invisible points. The Defense Logistics Agency classifies silver as a strategic material for one reason. Without it, the system collapses. And the system is getting more complex every year. A World War II tank was mostly mechanical. Steel, gears, armor. It used very little silver. A modern Abrams tank is a rolling data center. Sensors, computers, targeting systems, digital command links. It is quite literally a computer on tracks. And every layer of digitization increases silver consumption. The smarter the weapon, the more silver it needs to function. This is the quiet paradox of modern warfare. As weapons become more precise, more automated, and more lethal, they also become more fragile. They depend on fewer materials, more specialized materials, materials that cannot be improvised in a crisis, and one metal sits at the center of all of it. Silver is no longer just part of the machine. It is the machine's nervous system. And once you see that, a more dangerous question starts to form. What happens when that nerve system is stretched too thin? Once you understand how deeply modern warfare depends on silver, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this metal is that critical, Surely the United States protected it. Surely there was a buffer, a reserve, a vault somewhere filled with insurance against the unthinkable. There was, in the 1940s and 1950s, the United States held the largest silver stockpile in human history, more than 3 billion ounces, not as an investment, not as decoration, as strategy. Silver backed American coinage, but it also backed national survival. It was quietly routed into classified programs, including the Manhattan Project. In that era, Washington understood something we seem to have forgotten. Wars are not won by ideas alone. They are won by atoms. That stockpile was America's insurance policy, a guarantee that if supply lines snapped, factories would still run, missiles would still fly, the lights would stay on inside the war machine. Then the thinking changed. By the 1960s, confidence turned into complacency. Silver was removed from U.S. coinage. The logic sounded modern. Money was becoming digital. War was nuclear. Conventional materials felt obsolete. Silver, once treated like oxygen, was reclassified as excess baggage, a relic of an older world. And so the selling began. For the next 30 years, the U.S. government methodically liquidated its silver, auction after auction, year after year. Bars released onto the open market, commemorative coins minted and sold. America didn't just reduce its stockpile, it flooded the global market with it. Prices stayed low, not because silver lost value, but because the United States was dumping its inheritance in plain sight. This wasn't a single decision, it was a slow bleed, quiet, bureaucratic, invisible to the public. Each sale felt harmless, each sale felt temporary, and no one stopped to ask the obvious question. What happens when it's gone by the early 2000s? The answer arrived. The Defense Logistics Agency reported that the national defense stockpile of silver was effectively empty. The last bars were sold, the vaults were closed, the insurance policy was canceled. Today, the United States government owns virtually no strategic silver at all. When the USA Mint needs silver to produce coins, it buys blanks from private refiners on the open market. When defense contractors need silver for missiles or satellites, they buy it from commercial banks like any other customer. The country that once controlled global supply now waits in line. That is not dominance. That is dependency. America went from being the Saudi Arabia of silver to having no buffer whatsoever. No zappas, no margin for error. If supply from Mexico or Peru were disrupted tomorrow, production lines at major defense manufacturers would stop. Not slow down. Stop. And that is the moment the mistake becomes undeniable. The United States did not lose its silver. It sold it deliberately, gradually, confidently. It traded long-term security for short-term convenience. It cashed in its war insurance during peacetime and assumed the bill would never come due. Now the bill is arriving. And once you see how thin that margin really is, the next question becomes far more unsettling. What happens when a military built on abundance wakes up in a world of scarcity? Once the silver buffer was gone, the system didn't collapse immediately. That's the dangerous part. It kept running, quietly, smoothly. On a model borrowed from corporate America, the Pentagon adopted just-in-time logistics, the same philosophy used by retailers and tech firms. Don't store inventory. Don't tie up capital. Order only what you need, exactly when you need it. On paper, it looked efficient. In reality, it was a gamble. Just-in-time assumes the global market always works. Ships always sail. Mines always produce. Prices stay reasonable. Materials arrive on schedule. For decades, that assumption felt safe. The Cold War ended. Trade expanded. Supply chains stretched across oceans. The United States military outsourced resilience to the market and called it modernization. But markets don't fight wars, and markets don't care who needs metal more. Today, when a defense contractor needs silver, it does not pull from a national reserve. It enters the same global marketplace as everyone else. And in that marketplace, it is no longer the only buyer. Apple needs silver for devices. Samsung needs it for chips. Tesla needs it for batteries. The clean energy transition is pulling silver into panels, vehicles, and grids at industrial scale. The Pentagon is now competing with consumer electronics and electric cars for the same ounces. And that competition is ruthless. Defense contractors are not agile buyers. They operate under layers of government oversight. Many contracts are fixed price. That means if silver prices rise, the contractor eats the loss, so they hesitate. They delay purchases. They wait for prices to come down, but prices don't come down. Inventory disappears instead. This is how shortages form without headlines. Lead times for military-grade silver components stretch from days to weeks, then from weeks to months. Deliveries slip, programs slow, weapon systems miss schedules. The public explanation is always the same. Supply chain issues. The private translation is simpler. The metal isn't there. A system designed for efficiency is now colliding with scarcity. Just-in-time works when supply is abundant. It fails when materials become strategic. And silver has crossed that line. It is no longer just an input. It is a bottleneck. The U.S. military was built on the assumption that scale could solve any problem. Need more missiles, build more, need more planes, ramp production. But scale only works if inputs are guaranteed. When one critical material runs tight, the entire machine stalls. This is the hidden fragility of modern power. The just-in-time military does not break loudly, it breaks quietly. One delayed shipment, one postponed delivery, one rescheduled system. Until suddenly, readiness exists only on paper. What was once a strength is now a liability. Speed has replaced stockpiles. Efficiency has replaced redundancy. And the margin for error has shrunk to almost nothing. Just-in-time was built for peace. In a resource war, it becomes too late. And once that realization sets in, the question is no longer whether the system will change. The question is how far the government is willing to go when the market can no longer deliver. While the United States was dismantling its silver buffer, another power was doing the opposite. Quietly, patiently, methodically, China was preparing for a world where markets fail before missiles do. For more than 20 years, China has been accumulating physical gold and silver, not as a trade, not as a speculation, as policy, state policy. Beijing encouraged its citizens to own precious metals. Banks promoted physical holdings. Households stacked quietly. At the same time, the state built massive, government-controlled refineries and tightened its grip on processing capacity. Raw silver ore was restricted from leaving the country. Metal went in, finished metal stayed home. This wasn't about price. It was about control. China understands something fundamental about conflict that financial models tend to ignore. In any serious war, the first casualty is trade. Ports close, insurance disappears, shipping slows, markets freeze. When that happens, paper promises don't matter. Contracts don't matter. What matters is what you physically control inside your borders. And this is where the asymmetry becomes dangerous. China holds metal. The United States holds claims. In a normal market, that distinction feels academic. Futures, contracts trade, vault reports circulate, prices update on screens. But in a crisis, paper is only as good as a system enforcing it. If an exchange defaults, if settlement breaks, if trust evaporates, paper silver becomes a legal argument, physical silver becomes capability. If the paper market fractures, China still has the atoms, the United States has paperwork. That difference doesn't show up in headlines. It shows up when factories need inputs and can't get them. It shows up when missiles require components that can't be sourced. It shows up when a war plan assumes supply that no longer exists. China has structured its metal strategy around blockade logic. If borders close, production continues, missiles still get built. Satellites still launch. The industrial base remains intact because the material never had to cross an ocean in the first place. The United States made the opposite bet. It assumed markets would always clear. It assumed liquidity could replace inventory. It assumed that if silver was needed, it could always be bought. That assumption only holds in peacetime. This is why the distinction between physical metal and paper claims matters so much now. One survives stress, the other requires stability. China's advantage is not technological. It is logistical. It is elemental. It is rooted in the simplest rule of conflict. Whoever controls the material controls the outcome. This is not theory. It is doctrine. When supply chains tighten, the side with stockpiles gains leverage. When markets seize, the side with the refineries keeps moving. When paper breaks, the side with metal wins. And that reality reframes the entire balance of power. Because if a blockade ever comes, if markets ever lock up, if the paper-silver system ever cracks under pressure, the winner will not be decided by spreadsheets or contracts, it will be decided by vaults. And once that is clear, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What happens when the United States realizes it is competing in a physical war with a paper hand? Once the market stops working, the government does not ask nicely, it changes the rules. After years of flashing red indicators, Washington finally acknowledged the problem in writing. In February of 2021, the White House signed Executive Order 14017, titled America's Supply Chains. On the surface, it sounded bureaucratic, a 100-day review, semiconductors, batteries, critical minerals. Most people ignored it. That was the point. Read closely. The order was a confession. It was the U.S. government admitting that it had lost control over the materials required to function in a crisis, that dependence on foreign supply was now a national security threat. And once that admission was made, the response was no longer economic, it was legal. The backbone of that response is an old law, the Defense Production Act of 1950 passed during the Korean War. This is not a symbolic statute, it is a war power, and it was never repealed. Under Title III of the Act, the federal government can prioritize and allocate materials deemed essential for national defense. Not negotiate, not bid, allocate. When invoked, contracts are no longer equal, the market no longer decides who gets what. Priority does. This is where the alphabet matters. Procurement orders are assigned ratings. DU means high priority. DX means the highest national priority. A DX rated order must be filled before any DU order, and both must be filled before any unrated civilian order. If a supplier ignores a DX order, it is not a contract dispute. It is a criminal offense. In practice, the effect is immediate. If a defense contractor needs silver and the market is tight, the government does not wait for price discovery. It issues a rated order. A refinery receives a letter. The message is simple. Fill this military order first, before Apple, before Tesla, before the Mint. Everyone else waits. This is not confiscation in the dramatic sense. No agents knocking on doors, no seizures from private safes. That would be politically explosive. Instead, the government seizes the flow. Mines are redirected. Refinery output is pre-claimed. The tap is shut off at the source. Downstream, the effect looks like a shortage. Retail shelves empty. Dealer inventories vanish. Not because silver disappeared, but because it was legally spoken for before it ever reached the civilian market. This is soft confiscation, clean, quiet, efficient, in a crisis. Silver is no longer allocated by price. It is allocated by permission. The military eats first. The civilian economy gets what is left. If anything, this is how markets end without collapsing. Prices can still be quoted. Screens can still update. But availability disappears. The crowding out begins. The government does not need to compete with civilians. It outranks them. And once law replaces price as the allocation mechanism, a final line is crossed. The free market becomes a peacetime luxury. In an emergency, it is suspended. At that point, the question is no longer whether silver will be taken out of civilian circulation. The question is how much and how fast before anyone notices. Once the law takes control at home, the real vulnerability appears overseas because the Defense Production Act stops at the border. And borders are where America's silver problem becomes a geopolitical one. The United States imports roughly 80% of the silver it consumes. That is not a rounding error. That is structural dependence. The metal that powers missiles, satellites, and communications does not come from Nevada vaults. It comes from the ground of other nations. Mexico, Peru, Canada, Poland. Supply chains that look stable on a spreadsheet, but fragile on a map. Mexico sits at the center of this equation. It is the world's largest silver producer. Nearly a quarter of global output comes from Mexican soil. For decades, that silver flowed north with little friction. It was treated as a commercial input, not a strategic lever. That era is ending. Mexico's political winds have shifted toward resource nationalism. Lithium has already been nationalized. New open-pit mining permits have been restricted. Taxes and royalties on foreign miners are rising. The message is no longer subtle. Strategic resources should serve national interests first, not foreign militaries, not foreign industries. If Mexico decides to slow exports, tax them heavily, or redirect silver for domestic use, the U.S. defense supply chain feels it immediately. There is no backup switch. Canada produces silver, but not enough. Poland is far away and geopolitically exposed. Peru faces its own political instability. The redundancy is thinner than it looks. Washington knows this. That is why. In 2022, the State Department launched the Mineral Security Partnership. Think of it as a NATO for metals, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, European allies. The goal is simple: secure supply chains that bypass China and Russia, mine in friendly countries, refine with allies, keep the flow safe. But there is a flaw baked into the design. Most members of this partnership are consumers, not producers. The countries that actually control large silver reserves, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Bolivia, are not fully aligned. They are asking harder questions. Why sell raw wealth cheaply? Why power someone else's military and energy transition while absorbing the environmental cost? At the same time, China has been playing a longer game. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese state-owned firms have spent decades acquiring mines across Latin America and Africa. They build roads, ports, power plants. In exchange, they secure offtake agreements and ownership. Even when a mine sits in the Western Hemisphere, if it is Chinese-owned and contracted to Chinese refineries, the silver never reaches U.S. buyers. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. This creates a direct challenge to long-standing U.S. assumptions about influence in the region, and history offers a warning. In 1953, the United States backed a coup in Iran over oil. In 1973, it supported regime change in Chile over copper. When strategic resources are threatened, great powers do not remain passive. Silver is now entering that category. Control the land, control the mines, control the refineries. And you control the war. Lose them. And the most advanced weapons in the world become inert. This is no longer a supply chain issue. It is a map problem. And once wars are decided by geography instead of markets, the final phase of the crisis begins. At the end of this chain, there's no mystery left. Only math. Military planners don't talk about perfection. They talk about buffers. A 3-year buffer. Enough time to keep factories running if trade stops and ships don't sail. Based on current usage, that means roughly 100 million ounces of silver just for defense. But once energy infrastructure is treated as national security, that number jumps fast. The real target becomes closer to 500 million ounces. Now compare that to reality. Global silver production is about 830 million ounces per year. There isn't a hidden warehouse waiting. There isn't any spare capacity. To rebuild a reserve of that size, the U.S. government would have to absorb a massive share of global supply quietly, over time. And it wouldn't do it publicly. That's where the Exchange Stabilization Fund, created in 1934, enters the picture. It operates outside normal budgets. Minimal transparency, broad authority. If silver is deemed a strategic risk, it doesn't buy futures on a screen. It buys physical metal through proxies, bullion banks, private vaults, London, Switzerland. Slow, silent, relentless. This is the infinite bid. The government can print unlimited dollars. Silver cannot be printed. It has to be mined, refined, and moved. When infinite currency chases finite atoms, price becomes irrelevant. The goal isn't profit, it's possession. As that happens, civilians don't get outbid. They get locked out. Supply is redirected before it ever reaches retail. Spot prices still exist, but availability disappears. The market decouples from reality. At that point, silver stops being a trade. It becomes infrastructure. It becomes leverage. It becomes survival. Empires don't negotiate with physics. They submit to it. And physics says this: when war, energy, and money all depend on the same metal, that metal is no longer optional. Silver is no longer a trade. It is a necessity of empire.